Hello everyone, Comrade Marie here. Today's video is going to be quite a lengthy one. We will be discussing the question of life in the Second Spanish Republic. As we know, the Second Republic lasted from 1931 to 1939, born out of the collapse of the fascist dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera. At first a progressive bourgeois democratic government, it underwent a radical transformation into a People's Democratic Republic with the beginning of the Revolutionary War in 1936. This video will have a slightly different structure from my others, as I'm going to try to comprehensively describe life in the Republic in all its facets. Alright, let's get started. The average life for a proletarian in Spain was very difficult. The failing economy under Miguel Primo de Rivera left the Republic with a huge budget deficit. Spain remained a semi-feudal country and did not develop out of semi-feudalism until the late 1950s, as you know if you saw my last video. Wages were very low in 1931 and the worldwide depression did not help at all. Consequently, there were widespread poverty, and in the urban centers many shanty towns popped up. There was an increasing number of proletarians as petty bourgeois businesses shut down or were cast into the urban proletariat. Many peasants began moving into the cities. The proletariat had a new, growing hatred for the Catholic Church due to its defending of the interests of the landowning aristocracy and monopoly capitalists. This was shown in 1931 after the proclamation of the Republic with a series of church burnings that took place in urban areas. At the beginning of the war in 1936, life for the proletariat immediately got better due to the initiatives by the communists participating in the people's government, and we will get into that later in the video. Many workers joined the General Union of Workers and the Communist Party of Spain, and state repression against strikes intensified greatly as time went on. In 1931, 46% of the population were either peasantry or agricultural workers. Peasants lived and worked as sharecroppers on large estates known as LATIFUNDIA, which were about 25 hectares large. On these estates, health conditions were extremely poor, with malaria being commonplace. The peasants were given almost starvation-level accommodations. In 1932, some regulations were put in place to improve the conditions, but most were futile. Many peasants worked seasonal jobs in the city since they could barely support themselves from working on the latifundia. The National Federation of Agricultural Workers reached out to the peasant population and got around 40,000 members, and thus peasants represented 34% of strikers in 1932 and 29% in 1933. There was a growing amount of rural strikes, and they peaked from 1933 to 1934 as contradictions were heightening and growing sharper. The peasantry showed a great vigilance and passion for the class struggle, and this would be apparent since the People's Army and other affiliated militias would hold a large peasant population, and the Communist Party would have a one-third peasant composition. In 1930, over half of the population was illiterate, and almost 1 million children had no schooling whatsoever. Only 55% of the 5 to 14-year-olds were enrolled in school, and literacy rates were just 70%. Children from peasant families were needed for agricultural work, and even then the number of schools were few and far between. The nearest schools could have been almost an hour or 2-hour walk away. With the declaration of the Republic in 1931, some progress was made towards a better educated population. New schools were constructed around the country, most often being in a room in the town hall or a temporary school in a serviceable location, and religion was removed from some school curriculum. Despite this, schools still remained a privilege reserved for the upper strata of intellectuals and was largely inaccessible to the lowest masses of workers and peasants, who could not afford such, and this is of course to be expected under the bourgeois republic. Sweeping progress towards a more educated population came in 1936, under the new People's Government. The secondary schools and universities became places accessible to the ordinary masses, and culture was no longer locked behind status. Using the Ministry of Education, the communists carried out a campaign against illiteracy, and believed a literate population was absolutely necessary. 6 workers' colleges were formed where young people from working class and peasant families received their tuition, supplies, and general accommodations for free. These colleges prepared working-class boys and girls to enter higher institutions of learning, and these schools even taught disabled soldiers. Teacher salaries were also raised, whereas previously they were very low. As part of the Communist Party's initiative to eradicate illiteracy, they formed the quote-unquote cultural militia, turning the barracks into one large school that taught over 75,000 soldiers how to read. One soldier wrote to his mother, "You'll never believe it, mother, but it is I, your son, writing to you. I can already use a pen. Who would have thought it a few months ago? And I can read books. Mother, what a joy. And do you know what I am dreaming of doing once we won the war? Of being a student." Women in Spanish society were held back quite a lot due to the heavy influence of the Catholic Church in everyday life. From 1800 to 1922, single Spanish women enjoyed a few more legal rights than their married peers once they reached the age of 23. At that point, unmarried women could sign contracts and run businesses on their own behalf. Married women needed the approval or involvement of their husband to undertake such matters as changing their address, accepting an inheritance, or owning property or a business. All women in this period were denied the right to vote or run for political office. Religion required strict gender roles, which led to the repression of Spanish women and fostered ingrained sexism across the whole of Spanish society. The Catholic Church dictated that the role of women was to marry and bear children. They were to be invisible in society outside of the domestic sphere. Violation of these norms were often met with violence. During this period, the PSOE, or the Socialist Party, which was a social democratic party actually, did not want to advance the rights of women because they viewed the entire movement as bourgeois. The 8th of March 1924, a royal decree is Municipal Statute Article 51 for the first time included an appendix that would allow electoral authorities on a municipal level to list women over the age of 23 who were not controlled by male guardians or the state to be counted. Article 84.3 said unmarried women could vote in municipal elections assuming they were the head of the household. Over the age of 23, not prostitutes, and their status did not change. Women gained access to national representation during the 1927 and 1929 legislative period as a result of the decree of the 12th of September 1927. Article 15 stated, "To it may belong without distinction men and women, single, widowed, or married, duly authorized by their husbands as long as they do not belong to the Assembly. Its designation will be made nominally and by order of the Presidency, agreed in the Council of Ministers before October 6th. The 1927 to 1929 session also began the process of drafting the new Spanish Constitution that would have fully franchised women voters in Article 55. The article was not approved. Despite this, women were eligible to serve in the National Assembly and the Congreso de los Diputados, and 15 women were appointed to seats on the 10th of October 1927. The abdication of the king in 1930 brought an end to Miguel Primo de Rivera's dictatorship and the beginning of the bourgeois democratic republic. This is truly when the history of the proletarian women's movement begins. In 1930, there were approximately 6 million families, of which 85% were working class or peasant families. In 5 million of these, the women were doing exclusively household work. The employment of women was fraught with difficulties. Women had a level of illiteracy greater than men, over 50%. That meant that they were less likely to get a job, and most likely forced to take less skilled jobs than men. On top of this, there was no type of infrastructure to cater for women's childcare needs in the workplace. There were no infant schools where young children could go during the working day, and in general there were not enough school places for children at all. It still remained the social place of women to be child rearers and to produce the next generation of workers. So likewise, it was in the interest of the new bourgeoisie to keep women in their traditional home roles. Despite this, the 1931 Constitution, women won the right to vote and also the right to be elected to any public office. In 1932, laws on civil marriage and divorce were introduced. For the period, they were the most advanced in Europe, for they recognized divorce by mutual consent, and the right of women to the custody of children. This was a severe blow to the Catholic Church, which saw its role and influence within the family reduced. An enormous improvement was achieved for women as they were thus able to escape from the influence of the Catholic Church. In 1936, Catalonia legalized abortion, and it's not a coincidence that this region also saw the largest amount of women in the workforce. In 1935, prostitution, which had previously been recognized by law, was declared illegal. Until then, a woman's body was legally considered a commodity. Another constant problem was the wage discrimination women suffered, something that continues to this day. In 1930, the salary of female olive pickers was 50% of that of the men's for the same work. A female metal worker got 41.3% of her male's counterpart, and in the textile industry, the difference was 47.6%. In every sector, the maximum salary for women never reached the minimum for men for the same work. Furthermore, to this work, one has to add the work which was considered women's work, i.e. household work, which involves the longest hours and is the worst paid. In spite of this, the important rights for women with children were won, such as the maternity law, which regulated the breastfeeding period and maternity leave. The situation faced by rural peasants was not much better. 24% of working women worked in agriculture, and in many cases they received no pay, and had no working rights because this kind of work was considered as helping the family. Throughout the years of the bourgeois republic, that being 1931 to 1936, there were many strikes that women readily participated in. Between 1931 and 1934, bread was subject to numerous increases due to the scarcity of cereals produced during bad harvests. There were not only demonstrations. In the first few months of 1933, trains, trucks, and trams transporting food were raided, and food was confiscated and shared out among the workers' families. In Vizcaya, Almeria, Malaga, Granada, Valencia, and in Madrid, the women even went as far as raiding the food markets. The Spanish Committee of Women Against War and Fascism was founded as a women's organization linked to the Spanish Communist Party in 1933. They represented the proletarian feminist movement. Women Against War and Fascism was an organization founded by the Comintern. It started to gain strength in 1934, but after the Asturias Uprising it was outlawed, although it continued under the name of Pro Infancia Obrera, which means pro-working class children, an organization dedicated to supporting the wives and children of the miners killed or jailed in the Asturias Uprising after the 1935 insurrection, or 1934, I mean. From its very foundation, the Spanish Communist Party had a clear orientation towards women, campaigning to win them to the communist movement. The number of women in the PCE grew from 179 in 1936 to 4,203 in 1938. Peasant women represented a third of the PCE's membership. It was the Civil War which broke out in July 1936 that was to produce the most qualitative changes for women. As thousands of militiamen were mobilized to the front, women had to take over jobs left vacant by the men. This represented an important increase in women's class consciousness because this involved working outside of the home and in many cases achieving economic independence, which they had never achieved before. In Catalonia, for example, 9 out of 10 people engaging in the production of explosives were women. Not only this, but women occupied positions of combat within most factions. It was normal for women to serve alongside men in battalions. Meanwhile, the fascists raped and abused women they came across, most notably at the Battle of Madrid. Dolores Ibárruri, a centrist in the party at the time, quickly became a symbol for working women and traveled the country giving speeches to anti-fascists and widely encouraged women to take up arms to defend the Republic, and soon earned the nickname La Pasionaria. The slogan No Pasarán even originated from her in 1936. It is unfortunate that with the defeat of the Republic and the exile of the PCE in the USSR, Dolores Ibárruri would capitulate to Khrushchev and regress the revolutionary line on women. By the 60s, the PCE was encouraging women to remain in traditional roles and was espousing views of traditional motherhood in the same vein as Franco himself. The national question remained an issue for the National Revolutionary War. Under the fascist dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Catalan, Galician, and Basque nations were oppressed and deprived of all democratic and national rights. The 1932 Catalan Statute brought a measure of autonomy to the Catalan nation, but due to the lack of understanding of the national question by the various Republican and Social Democratic parties, they ignored the plight of the Basque and Galician people and were unwilling to work with the Basque Nationalist Party due to its pro-Catholic stance. The Basque nationalist statute would be brought to the Cortes in 1933, but it was completely ignored and not even debated. Many anarchist and Republican parties also opposed working with the Basque nationalists due to their pro-clerical stance, ignoring the fact that we must strive to unite with all progressive forces and to not hit out in all directions, as Mao tells us. Although the 1931 Constitution proclaimed equality for every man and woman, it wouldn't be until the beginning of the war that the people truly began to exercise equal democratic rights. On October 1st, 1936, the Republican Cortes approved the Basque Statute, which allowed the first Basque autonomous government under the leadership of the Basque Nationalist Party to be formed. Unfortunately, for the majority of the war, Galicia was under fascist occupation, leaving them to face brutal repression. There is also the question of external colonies which belonged to Spain, those being Morocco, Equatorial Guinea, Western Sahara, and the Canary Islands. The problem, however, is that when discussing these, there's been very little analysis into the colonial question, and no analysis at all when it comes to the question of the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands constitute a nation by the definition put forward in Marxism and the National Question by Stalin. The most that can be said definitively is about Morocco. Moroccan men were treated lesser by the fascist forces and were drafted into the fascist armies, and Equatorial Guinea was used as a place where Franco would send political dissidents. I may potentially do a video talking about Canary and their constitution as a nation, but for now let's move on. In 1933, the general elections were held, in which the fascist party known as the Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights, or SEDA, won a parliamentary majority, shifting power away from the PSOE and other Republican left parties. Prime Minister Alejandro Lerroux, a member of the Radical Republican Party, was set to meet with SEDA ministers to form a coalition government. News of this betrayal by the Social Democrats angered the people, and the masses responded in October of 1934. In several mining towns in Asturias, local unions gathered small weaponry in preparation for the strike. It began on the evening of October 4th, with the miners occupying several towns, attacking and seizing local civil assault guards and barracks. At dawn on October 5th, 1934, the rebels attacked the Brothers' School in Turon. The brothers and the Passionist father were captured and imprisoned in the House of the People. While waiting for a decision from the Revolutionary Committee, the committee decided to condemn them to death. 34 priests, 6 young seminarians with ages between 18 and 21, and several businessmen and civil guards were summarily executed by the revolutionaries in Mieres and Sama. 58 religious buildings, including churches, convents, and part of a university at Oviedo, were burned and destroyed. The revolutionaries organized local Soviets as a means to better organize themselves and govern their captured towns. Taking Oviedo, the Republics were able to seize the city's arsenal, gaining up to 24,000 rifles, carbines, and light and heavy machine guns. Recruitment offices drafted all workers between the ages of 18 and 40 for the quote-unquote Red Army. 30,000 workers had been mobilized for battle within 10 days. The social fascist government in Madrid now faced a crisis like they'd never seen before, an insurrection at their doorstep. Unfortunately, the Asturias uprising was defeated precisely due to the spontaneous nature and lack of leadership. Lerroux and Zamora declared martial law and called on generals Manuel Goded and Francisco Franco to suppress the uprising. Both generals were veterans from Spain's genocidal Morocco pacification. Colonial garrisons from Morocco were brought in, and on October 7th, the Spanish Republican Navy fired on the towns with a coastal bombardment. The brutality and repression shown were nothing short of horrific. The colonial troops were used to participating in such repressive and vile actions, and Asturias was no different. They raped, looted, and executed any worker they could find. And due to heavy press censorship, there's little information about this being spread to the rest of the country. Some other minor incidents occurred in places such as Catalonia, but nothing on the scale of Asturias. Bourgeois historians often refer to the uprising as the prelude to the Spanish Civil War, so to speak. This is a very true statement, but what must be recognized even more so is that if not for the heroic sacrifice of the masses in this uprising, Spain would likely have succumbed to fascism much earlier, possibly even right then in 1934. But the uprising delayed SEDA's plans for an attempt to consolidate power the legal way, along the lines of Hitler. In the aftermath, fascists drummed up anti-Semitic rhetoric regarding the uprising being a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, and Franco himself stated that the uprising was being led by quote-unquote Moscow agitators. While anarchists, syndicalists, and communists alike all fought alongside each other in the uprising, it was primarily efforts by the communists which made it possible. In a speech given in 1935, Comrade Jose Diaz acknowledges the heavy role the communists played in the uprising and touches on the passive-aggressive role the Social Democrats played toward the masses. He says, "Comrades, let all who want to hear it hear it. The communists have called the masses to struggle and insurrection. They have taken the lead and fought against the repressive forces of reaction and of fascism with weapons in hand. The Communist Party is thus identified with the insurrectionary movement and assumes full political responsibility. I repeat this because it seems that there are people out there who shake off the fleas and do not want to be told anything about what happened. They want nothing with the insurrection in Asturias or with the October struggles. We, the Communist Party, understand very well that certain people neglect the responsibilities of the movement. And if we did not go out in the public and to the square and shout at the top of our lungs that everything when the revolutionary masses did in October, that the insurrection in Asturias is a glorious fact and that it is the result of all our struggle." The full speech can be found in the book 3 Years of Struggle by Jose Diaz, which I am going about translating. I will include the translation in the description, and I have translated up to this point of the speech. But anyways, it is apparent this sacrifice was noble and brave on the part of the masses. This incident was only used as a pretext to intensify repression against the masses and progressive forces. 1,700 workers died and up to 30,000 were held as prisoner. This experience should very much be remembered for the lessons it gives to the international communist movement and for the bravery of those who fought and died. With the beginning of the Civil War, the masses of Spain went about transforming the republic into a genuine democracy for the people, destroying the feudal remnants and building a popular progressive government consisting of a union between the working class, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and progressive bourgeoisie. This type of government would become known as a people's democracy, and it is a progressive multi-class front with the purpose of fighting fascism and building socialism. Mao Zedong later would theorize the concept of new democracy as being a progressive multi-class front against imperialism applied in semi-feudal countries, which would be proved to be a more effective version of the people's democracy. While the Spanish people's democracy was not a socialist state, since it never fully abolished capitalist and semi-feudal relations, it provided the working class an effective democratic system, and the Communist Party participation in Largo Caballero's government is what represented chiefly their interests. Despite the proletariat being the main decisive force of this government, they were unable to exercise full consistent leadership due to the disorganized nature of the Popular Front. This again is why Mao Zedong's thesis on new democracy would be effective, because it clearly outlines the necessity for the proletariat to lead the union of classes under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Nevertheless, the PCE had a clear and unwavering vision for the revolution in Spain. Meanwhile, other social democratic ministers like Largo Caballero faltered and even displayed capitulationist tendencies. The parties which made up the government were the Communist Party of Spain, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, the Republican Left, the Republican Union, the Catalan Nationalist Party, the Galician Nationalist Party, the General Union of Workers, and the CNT-FAI. The later betrayal of the anarchist Social Democrats and Trotskyites would further stress the need for the lead of the Communist Party and the working class. In the first few days of the war, a group of communists went to the barracks to call on soldiers to join the war against fascism. They seemed hesitant, and one eventually asked, "Well, what about the land? What's going to happen to that?" The communists replied that all land would be given to the peasants when the fascists were defeated, and upon hearing that, the men were off to the front. The peasant question is still a large and glaring question for the revolution. On October 7, 1936, the Communist Minister of Agriculture, Vicente Uribe, signed a historic decree demanding the expropriation of all rural latifundia estates of those who had taken part in the fascist counter-revolution, regardless of size. over 13.5 million acres were taken and distributed amongst 13,000 peasant and agricultural worker families to be cultivated collectively and individually. They were also given animals, new tools, machinery, and over 2 million pesetas in loans. Things were very different in the fascist-occupied zones. Wherever Franco's men went, the landlords and aristocracy received their property back. Peasants were evicted and forced to pay up their full debts, and in many cases just shot. The peasant struggle was not only defending the republic, but also now defending the new land given to them, and this is what motivated them to not only work hard, not just on the battlefield, but also on their new land. Despite the raging war, wheat and other productions had increased the output between the years 1936 and 1937. The Republic was not just fighting against land-owning aristocracy, of course, but also monopoly capitalists that sided with Franco. The bankers and large industrial owners for the most part abandoned their business concerns in the Republican-occupied areas, and for the sake of the war it was necessary these industries were kept running. The National Bank of Spain was nationalized and brought under a new administration, allowing trade union representation along with railways, other transportation, and the entirety of the war industry. The Republican government adopted several social measures to improve worker conditions, but due to the demands of the war, some sacrifices had to be made, such as longer work weeks. In many factories, shock brigades were organized to increase the level of production. In Catalonia, the anarchists carried out a disorganized policy of quote-unquote collectivization and opposed the centralization, sabotaging the efforts for a real work economy. The Communist Party of Spain and the United Socialist Party of Catalonia put forward reasonable social measures to ensure the livelihoods of the workers and consolidate the democratic rights, meanwhile opposing the anarchists who made demands that were unreasonable for a time of war. The anarchists also carried out unnecessary excesses against religion, raping and massacring priests and other Catholics. Meanwhile, the People's Army carried out its expropriation of the churches in an orderly manner that minimized innocent casualties, in an attempt to exercise a true democratic answer to the religion question. Dolores Ibarruri even took personal steps to provide living conditions for nuns displaced by the war. The old army served as an arm to Spanish reaction before the beginning of the war. The Spanish Republican Army was used to occupy colonial territory, suppress the many strikes, and crush the Asturias uprising. Likewise, the creation of a new and genuinely popular army to defend the gains of the people's democracy was necessary, and that was the People's Army of the Republic. The Communist Party led the efforts to reorganize the army from the disorganized pro-Republican militias into a People's Army for the defense of the Republic, and also took steps to arm the labor unions like the UGT. The new function of the army was to serve the people. The army engaged in mass work to educate the masses politically. The cultural militia, which was previously mentioned, taught around 75,000 soldiers how to read and write. But on top of that, there was something also known as the theater guerrillas, which put on plays for people in the cities and even brought mobile libraries with them for the people to use. The Communist Party, back in 1934, formed the anti-fascist worker and peasant militia, and many members of that went on to be part of what was known as the 5th Regiment, which became one of the most well-known and elite sections of the People's Army, and was part of the final defense of Madrid. The Communist International took an active involvement with helping the people's government by organizing the international brigades. Stalin wrote in a letter to José Díaz that the struggle in Spain was not just a Spanish struggle, but one for all of humanity. The NKVD provided the People's Army with intelligence, training, supplies, and other aid. Communist parties from around the world sent volunteers, and most volunteers were sent from the French Communist Party. Unfortunately, Juan de Grin dissolved the brigades in 1938 in an attempt to win British and French support due to the Non-Intervention Pact, in a horrendous betrayal of the masses. There were 84 divisions in total. The most basic unit of the People's Army was the Mixed Brigade, made up of foreign volunteers and Spanish people. The other type of brigade were regular Army Corps, made up entirely of Spanish people, and also there were 3 guerrilla divisions at the rear guard, which were used mainly to support the regular Army Corps. Those guerrillas fled to France after the war and began an underground anti-fascist resistance against the fascist state, They were known as the Spanish Maquis. Guerrilla resistance against the fascist state would take place through many different organizations throughout its existence and even after. I'll leave a full list of the divisions below in the sources for anyone who wishes to see that and is interested. Of course, some sections of the army did not remain fully loyal, and most notably, this was the divisions under POUM control. POUM leaders from the very beginning had made attempts to break up the anti-fascist unity and the attempted putsch in 1937 against the Republic demonstrated their intentions clearly. On May 3rd, it was suggested that the Catalonian military authorities should take over the telephone service. It was intolerable, for instance, when the Minister of Interior was talking to one of the provincial governors, telling him what action to take against those responsible for the various provocative activities that the POUM's agents should be listening in and able to warn their people to clear out. At the same time, the Catalan authorities decided to dissolve once and for all the control patrols, which had been formed immediately after Franco's rebellion began and which had become inundated with all kinds of disruptive elements and adventurers. It was also taking in hand the organization of the army on the Aragon front. The POUM, finding that this situation was daily growing more unfavorable and that the masses were disapproving of its policy, chose this moment for its putsch. Inevitably, the question arises, what were the real aims of the POUM in launching this putsch? With only some thousands of supporters at its disposal, it could not hope to seize power for itself. But it could hope to disrupt and split the two trade union organizations just when their relations were improving. This is shown by the fact that as soon as the putsch began, the leaders of the POUM tried to win over their side some of the wilder elements of the CNT and tried to get them to take part in street fighting against both the forces of the UGT and those of the Catalan authorities and of the central government. Thanks to the calmness and energy of the leaders of these two organizations, this disaster was avoided, and the Trotskyists found themselves on the barricades alone with the fascists of the Fifth Column and a handful of disorderly elements. I will leave a link below to the sources to the full article known as Trotskyism in Service of Franco, which documents the treachery of the POUM and its many attempts to split working-class anti-fascist unity. In conclusion, the Second Spanish Republic provides us many great lessons for our time. The way the masses stood up as one in an attempt to smash the fascist threat, and how they constructed for themselves a new, truly democratic People's Republic on the ashes of the old bourgeois republic, which merely facilitated the fascist threat. If you all enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications, and please join my Discord server, which I'll link to below. I will end this video with a quote from General Secretary Jose Diaz in his article on the lessons of the Spanish People's War. The War of the Spanish People showed that in difficult and dangerous situations, when the outcome of the struggle was at stake, all other parties and organizations except the Communist Party gave up and capitulated. Their policies and activities resulted in the disorganization of the masses, strengthening the Communist Party at every link in the chain, strengthening its initiatives, its close link to the masses, and especially its independent activity. These are the conditions essential to reducing to a minimum the hesitation of one's allies and overcoming any possible betrayal. To overcome the external enemy it is essential to the same time destroy the internal enemy. To defeat the enemy in the People's Revolution, it is essential to break the old state apparatus which serves reaction and replace it with a new apparatus which serves the working class.